Hello, my name is Clarissa Morosky, and I am the co-founder and CEO of the Reloop platform. Delighted to have you join us today when I'm going to be talking to Dr. Dominic Hogg about a very interesting new study that has come out called Materials or Gases: How to Capture Carbon. But before I start, let me tell you a little bit about Reloop. Reloop works at the center of policymaking with governments, industry stakeholders, and NGOs, leading the transition to a global circular economy where our natural resources remain resources. Our policy positions and recommendations are always based on data-driven research, real-world case studies and experience, best-in-class principles, and the collective expertise of our team. I am delighted to have with us once again Dr. Dominic Hogg. Now, for those of you that don't know Dominic has over 30 years of experience in environmental matters as a campaigner, a research, and an excellent consultant. For the last 20 years, since 2001, he was the Eunomia Research and Consulting founder and chairman. There, he led the company's work on policy, strategy, and sustainable business. But today, he's the principal of Equanimator, seeking new ways to solve the key environmental problems facing us. Dominic, it's great that you could join us today. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me again, Clarissa. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. So I was thrilled to see that you just authored a very important study that was put out under the Zero Waste Europe banner called Materials or Gases: How to Capture Carbon. And it seems relevant. We are in the middle of a plastics treaty process, but at the same time, just finished another COP meeting. Tell me why this report is so relevant today.
Well, I suppose the brief answer is that we're trying to decarbonize everything, aren't we? And that includes the materials in the products that we purchase. But of course, at some point, we end up discarding them. We'd ideally like to have as many of those coming back into the chain of use as possible. We'd like to maybe be consuming less. We've also got to decarbonize what's going on with the way we manage waste. In the EU, we have quite a lot of incineration capacity. And so there's going to be a focus in the future as to how we not only scale that down, but for the facilities that carry on operating, how are they going to decarbonize? How are they going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that they're actually contributing to climate change over time? And we've looked at two different technologies for doing that, and the two in combination.
So let's talk about those two technologies that you looked at. You looked at leftover mixed waste sorting and carbon capture and storage. Now, some of our audience may not be technical people, so could you explain both those technologies in layman's terms, please?
Okay, so if, like me, your municipality provides you with a recycling service, you try and make sure you use that well, but you're not doing it perfectly, and so there's some stuff left over. That's what we call the leftover mixed waste. It's possible these days to have another go at that leftover mixed waste to try and, pick out some of the materials that we probably should have sorted out if we were perfect individuals in the first place. So it's trying to have a second go at the recycling of the materials. So one way of trying to decarbonize incineration, if you like, is to take more of the material out so that it can be recycled, noting that some of that material, actually a reasonable share of it, is plastic. And plastic contains the fossil carbon that leads to the fossil CO2 emissions when the waste is combusted. So we're basically using that leftover mixed waste sorting system to reduce the CO2 emissions from the incinerator, but also to reduce emissions associated with making stuff by making secondary material available instead of primary. The carbon capture and storage approach is different in that basically it leaves the incineration process more or less as it is. It doesn't take out any material in advance. There's a lot of cleanup technology at a modern incinerator these days that's seeking to clean the gas that is emitted into the atmosphere when the material is combusted. So what the carbon capture and storage process does is most of the processes that people are looking at take the gas after it's been through that cleanup process, and it can be piped underground storage, for example. That looks like metal pipe work, and there's a tower that's used for the scrubbing. The mixed waste sorting, the leftover mixed waste sorting, on the other hand, looks a bit like a warehouse. So it's got lots of moving parts in it, conveyors, sorters, interesting machinery, but it's essentially a little like a warehouse.
So tell me a little bit about the costs of the two technologies relative to the kinds of returns that you can get from each of them.
With a leftover mixed waste sorting, once you get to the scale of a typical incinerator, and the average EU incinerator is around 200,000 tons. It's dealing with 200,000 tons of waste. What this process is, it's not as capital intense in terms of per ton of material it's dealing with than say the CCS system. There's a fair amount of operating cost. There's not a huge amount of energy involved per ton of waste going through it. And you end up with a cost where the net cost position is significantly influenced by how much you manage to sell your materials for. So there's some uncertainty about that cost. And if the material prices are particularly low at some point, then the cost of that process goes up in net terms. Equally, if the value of those materials goes up, and it might do, interestingly, if we start to value carbon more, then if the value of those materials goes up, then the net cost of that process falls. With a carbon capture and storage process, what's typically going on is you are using some of the energy from the waste to energy facility to power the carbon capture and storage process. The cost of that process are partly determined by how you account for the lost value of the energy that you used, but also by the capital equipment and the operating costs of the CCS facility itself, but also having stripped the CO2 out and compressed it has to go somewhere. So there's a not insignificant cost of transporting the CO2, which will vary depending on where the incinerator is located, not only on land, as it were, but typically these storage sites are in the ocean, and so either the CO2 has to be then tankered to the storage point, or indeed there might be a pipe network that takes the CO2 out there for hopefully permanent storage under the ocean.
Tell me a little bit about what your findings showed in terms of the recommendation towards mixed waste sorting. How strong was that? What about a combined approach doing the two? What would that look like?
As you said, we looked at this for the technology separately and also for the technologies in combination. Separately, for the system as a whole, the CO2 savings we don't get the same level as if we're capturing 90 to 95% of the CO2 emissions through a CCS process post-combustion. But what we get it at a far lower cost per ton of CO2 saved. Not all of the CO2 saved is the same post-combustion extraction of the CO2. We're not trying to capture it. What we're trying to do is provide materials for the economy that can lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from using secondary materials instead of primary ones. And also, because some of those materials are fossil carbon materials themselves, like plastics, we're actually stopping them from being emitted in the first place. So there's two components to what we're actually achieving with the leftover mixed waste sorting. Under the assumptions we've used, there's a relatively low cost per ton of CO2 reduction achieved. With the CCS, on the other hand, we have a much higher cost per ton of CO2 removed effectively and stored, but we actually achieve a higher level overall of CO2 reduction removal. The question then is, well, could we combine them? And could we actually combine them in a positive way. But actually combining the two looks really interesting. Combining the two, first of all, it gives us overall system reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, but it gives that total reduction at an average cost of CO2 saved that's somewhere between the mixed waste sorting and the carbon capture and storage. So we're sort of helping to reduce the average cost of those emissions associated with using those two in combination and achieving a greater impact. So it looks like a really promising thing. More importantly, though, what it says to me, we might as well get on and do the leftover mixed waste sorting now. We know we can do it. It'll probably take us a shorter time where it's possible to do so. The interesting thing again with the sorting plant is we don't have to locate it at the same site as the incinerator itself. So looking forward, what we probably ought to be trying to do in Europe is asking ourselves, where do we really need incineration in the future? Countries who've already got some are probably going to carry on having some. And there are some countries like Belgium, Denmark, who are already thinking about, well, how do we scale back our capacity?
So speaking of Europe, we will have a EU emissions trading scheme. And I'd like to know, how is that connected to this report, or how might that help mixed waste sorting come to fruition in more countries in the near future?
That's an interesting question. These emission savings, because they accrue to different parts of the economy effectively, particularly with the mixed waste sorting, they're not necessarily going to be fully incentivized by an emissions trading scheme, or not in an obvious way. On the other hand, the CCS savings will accrue fairly directly to the operator in incinerator. So the emissions trading scheme, just to explain this, it doesn't by and large include incineration plants at the moment. It includes all other power plants, and some countries have volunteered to have their incineration plants partially covered by the ETS. And so what that would mean is that the emissions of each ton of CO2 effectively have a cost to the operator. So the operator then has an incentive to reduce the emissions. But they only have the incentive to reduce the emissions if the cost of reducing them is lower than the cost, the price that they're going to pay to emit CO2. That's a bigger hurdle for CCS than it is for leftover mixed waste sorting. So what we need to be careful to do, in my view, is to make sure that our policy in future doesn't undermine the case for doing both. In due course, the ETS might well incentivize carbon capture and storage. But why do that without leftover mixed waste sorting, if by using the leftover mixed waste sorting, we can help decarbonize other material sectors in the economy, and we can also start to reduce the amount of incineration capacity we need and the amount of fossil CO2 that we're sending up into the sky in the first place. We're passionate about trying to make sure we decarbonize materials by substituting secondary materials for primary ones. With the stuff that is left over, we also need to decarbonize that, and leftover mixed waste sorting is a technology we think has applicability whether your ultimate destination for the waste is a landfill or incinerator, because you're pulling out valuable material for the economy and you're generating CO2 savings. We should be thinking, well, how do we make sure we're configuring these systems so that we don't lock ourselves in, throwing away into the residual waste bin more than we have to.
Thank you so much for your time today. We will look for that study online. I understand that you can get it on the Zero Waste Europe website. So thank you. And we'll put a link on this video at the end so that people can get there. I look forward to hearing more from you on the European policy front to continue to push this incredible opportunity of leftover mixed waste sorting. Thank you very much for your time, Dominic.
And thanks so much again to you, Clarissa. Have a great evening.
All the best. Bye.